Hi, I'm Ermi Desai, editor here at MoveSmartly.com, and it's a pleasure to once again welcome you, whether you're viewing us on our YouTube channel or listening to us on our Apple podcast. Move Smartly is powered by Velocity Realty in Toronto, which is led by my co-host, John Pasalis. I don't often get a chance to fully introduce John, so I'm going to take a moment to do so here. John is the broker and president at Velocity Realty, where he uses his analytical approach to real estate, including his research as a doctoral candidate at Rotman at the University of Toronto and at the University of Reading in the UK, to help his sales team better advise consumers and clients, and to better advise citizens and policymakers about key housing issues. For our episode this month, John and I are going to do something a bit new. This is going to be the first of a semi-regular sit-down where we will chat about the biggest housing idea that John is currently thinking, writing, or talking to the media about right now. If you enjoy listening to our show and find it useful, please hit the subscribe button. Doing this helps to ensure that other listeners can find our show. And now, on to the show. Hi, John. How are you doing?
Keeping a busy week in Toronto real estate as always.
Yeah, it has been a busy month for not only trends in the real estate market being notable, but also policy impacts when it comes to everything from mortgage rates to different levels of governments and arguments over various housing crises. So it has been a really busy one. Of all these things, what story has really got your attention right now? What are you thinking about the most right now?
It's interesting because the stories I find that stick with me the most are not the ones that are in the headlines or that you read about. They're kind of the human stories, and I think that's why housing is such a big issue with me and such a big factor in my life, because we see these issues every day when we work with people. Last week or this week, I was at our office and I just got a call randomly about a property that's one of our agents has listed for lease, that someone, a prospective tenant, is interested in. And she was in tears on the phone, and it was so heartbreaking because, she's talking about how much she loves the home and she hopes she gets it. She's bid on 5 other properties so far and she keeps getting rejected. She's getting evicted from her home from her landlord because her landlord is planning on moving into that property. And they just can't find a rental. And she said, their income isn't necessarily strong enough, but they've had a co-signer who has tons of capital and net worth and a strong income. And they've even offered to pay 2 years rent up front, which is, insane, quite frankly. And they keep getting rejected. And it was, the conversation was, of course, about the stress. And I didn't mention, she's they're a family of 5, they have 3 kids. And the stress this is having on them and on their kids, knowing that you're getting kicked out of your home without knowing where you're going next because you cannot find another home, is just unbelievably stressful. So, it was something I posted about on Twitter. It's just, and I could only give her so much advice. Obviously, I don't know the circumstances of her situation, but it's a very, very challenging market for people who are looking at renting right now.
Yeah, and you got a lot of reaction to that thread on Twitter, and it's a story that really actually affects me personally. Now renting's always been a challenge in the Toronto area, and I've been a renter at different stages in my life, including as a child with my own family. And so, that stress and that worry, I actually breaks my heart to hear that. But is there something specific about renting right now that is making it particularly difficult and even desperate for renters?
Yeah, so it's not, I don't want to make it sound like this is new. This has been going on for quite some time. Our vacancy rate in the Toronto area is probably in the 1% range, which is a very tight market. And really what's happening, I think this is, it's something we've talked about, I think, on other segments. It is this buildup over time of the fact that, our population is booming, but we're not building any more homes. Our population was growing by, say, 400,000 people per year for 20 years at that rate. Now we're growing by 1.2 million, but we're still only building 200,000 homes, right? And when that happens for years, and this has been building up, you get to this point where you have this massive mismatch between the demand for housing, and the availability for housing, right? And there are a lot of side effects. I mean, generally that drives up housing costs. And while people who own housing have benefited incredibly from this boom, anyone who owns real estate has seen the value of their homes go up. I just tweeted the other day, like since 2020, the average Canadian home has gone up 40%, which is over 200,000 in 3 years, right? And that's Canada, and Toronto is actually a higher number. So anyone who owns real estate has really benefited from this housing crisis, quite frankly. But it's really renters that are sort of paying the price, I guess, of this crisis, because not only do they get no benefit from this appreciation in house values, but they're actually paying out of pocket a much higher rent today. So today, the challenge, you talk about what's the challenge? It's not just this mismatch between demand and supply, but it is also that rents are skyrocketing. Like in many Canadian cities, they're up double digits, and in some cases, almost 20% in a single year, which means you're paying substantially more if you end up getting kicked out of your apartment to find even equivalent rentals. So again, it's the households who are renting that are really kind of feeling the pressure of this housing market. And of course, some of those renters want to be buyers. So they're facing in two ways. It's harder to save because you're paying more in rent, and it's gonna be harder to actually buy. But even for the households who don't plan to buy, it is still unbelievably stressful, because again, the way our housing market works, a lot of our rentals are in like single family homes, condos, houses, whatever. And there isn't as much tenant security in those as if you live in a permanent rental apartment building. In this case, the landlord's just kicking them out because they want to move into the unit. And obviously that's putting a lot of pressure on these tenants. So this is the challenge, I think, that tenants are facing. It's these rapidly rising prices and this incredible competition, which effectively means you're only getting a place if you're like the top tenant, the best profile, the best income, the best credit, because there are so many people competing. The landlord can just sit back and wait and cherry pick who they're going to choose. And I think this is where it's putting pressure on households whose income or credit isn't perfect, and that is a lot of households, and they're having the hardest time getting into this market and finding affordable housing.
And you talk about that increased competition, and I know you write a lot about immigration policy and how we're seeing some of the highest growth rates in immigration, actually in population growth in Canada, driven majority by immigration rates. And you've written very extensively about that in our latest Move Smartly report for the month. But in addition to that, are these numbers, stories that I'm seeing in the news about, Ukrainian refugees fleeing conflict, even some Russian citizens leaving because of the impact of sanctions on their own country. Also, we hear about the ever increasing numbers of students from India and China coming here for post-secondary education, and the attraction of skilled workers continues. I know it's a new thing, but Canada's just announced a bid to attract U.S. green card holders, has received something like 10,000 applications in 2 days in the IT field. Now, do these headlines translate into actual people that you hear in your office or your team looking for rents that fit into rental units that fit into these categories?
100%. And I'll say, like, most of our population boom is actually non-permanent residents. Immigration, like in the past 12 months, our population grew by 1.2 million. Immigration was just under 500,000. So it's non-permanent residents. And yeah, of course, in our office, I mean, we've had clients who are refugees from Ukraine, and they're moving here. And, many of them, these are like refugees who are coming, with capital, with assets or whatever. And, and they're coming here and they're just shocked, like, at what they're able to afford to rent. Number one, like, what you're getting for $2,500 a month, you're getting a 1-bedroom apartment or maybe a 1+ den. And the fact that the rental market is so competitive. I mean, again, you have to imagine, if you are, a family that has no credit history and, quite frankly, no employment, it's hard to get housing. And many of these households are paying 12 months rent up front. and I'll say, like, some landlords are more flexible, I don't know, compassionate or whatever it is, and are willing to take the risk because there are risks as a landlord. They always worry, what if, they can't collect rent or whatever, because, and yes, having 12 months rental fund provides some security, but, landlords are always, well, what happens on the 13th month? Are they going to have income, and are they going to be able to pay the rent? So, because the landlord has to pay their mortgage at the end of the day. So it's super competitive for them. And, many of them end up getting rejected like 3, 4, 5 times before eventually finding someone who will lease it to them. So yeah, it's impacting all of these households, unfortunately.
And when you talk about risks to landlords, of course, on the other side of that, presumably, is the protection for tenants. So can you unpack for us exactly what the scene is in the Toronto area? How can landlords, like, how are they restricted? What can they do and what can't they do when it comes to selecting renters, when it comes to setting rents, and when it comes to evicting renters?
That's a good question. So setting rents. So rents generally, if a property is vacated, you can basically charge whatever rent you want. You charge the market rents. Rent controlled, we have on properties that are existing, occupied, that were built before 2018. And those are effectively rent controlled properties, but it's not. Rent control only means that your rent can only go up to 2.5% per year or less than that. So landlords, when a property has been vacated, they can charge whatever they want. There's no real limit on it. Now, there is this sort of tension and balance between tenants' rights, and I'm kind of probably one of few kind of landlords and people in the real estate industry who's biased towards tenants' rights. And tenants having security of tenure and all of those things, I think, is super important. And even rent control, I support. The challenge, I think, right now is sometimes the market can, and if it favors tenants too much, it starts creating negative side effects. And what's happening right now is that if a tenant stops paying rent, it is so hard to evict a tenant. Like, they could be in the apartment not paying rent for 12 months or trash the apartment, whatever it is, and it could take you a year to evict them. Like, so some tenant advocacy groups might say this is a good thing because we're protecting tenants, but on the flip side, it's partly what's causing this anxiety that landlords have to only cherry pick the best tenant and just wait. And they would rather keep their apartment empty for 1 or 2 months, waiting for what they think is the highest likelihood there's going to be a tenant pay the rent, versus taking the risk and having someone not pay their rent for a year, right? And I think that's the one challenge in this market, this balance between, protecting tenants, which we should, because there are a lot of terrible things that happen. Landlords are kicking out tenants illegally. They shouldn't be. Like, they're kicking them out sometimes, arguing that it's for their own use, and then just renting it out and charging a higher rent. Like, that technically is not allowed, and certainly landlords should be charged for doing that if they're kind of breaking the law. But the flip side is, if it takes you a year to evict a tenant who's not paying rent, I mean, that's very problematic, because the landlord has mortgage to pay, and obviously it's putting a financial stress on them, and this is what their biggest concerns are.
And just to understand as well, a little bit more detail, rent control, does it affect every unit? Like, even if you're renting a unit out, let's say your basement in a home that you're living in?
So yeah, basically what happened was they changed the laws in Ontario. Let's just say in 2018. So basically, any rental unit that was built before November 15, 2018 is rent controlled, which basically means you can only increase the rent by the rate that the province has set each year, which happens to be 2.5%. Anything that was basically completed and occupied after that date is not rent controlled, right? So if you're moving into a newly completed condominium that just finished today, and you move into it and you're paying a certain rents today, your landlord can increase the rent as much as they want tomorrow. There's no limits on it, right? Like, most good landlords will not just jack up the rent because they want to keep their tenant and they want to charge market rents. but they could in theory charge more than 2.5%, which is the provincial guideline, because those units are not rent controlled.
And what if you created that basement rental after 2018, for example?
So actually, that's a good question. I have to.
It's a gray area. There's some, and I think that's what
because-
makes it challenging,
I
right?
think it's because the home itself has been built and occupied before 2018. I don't know if that's like a loophole if if it was a vacant basement and unfinished, if you created the rental suite. I mean, that's a good question. I have to look.
And I ask it only because, to me, seems like on top of struggling to find rental units, you have to be really educated as a renter on really complex things, and kind of, the number 2018, like, these numbers are not obvious. You have to sort of really get knowledgeable about rental rules in this market. Really fast, even if you're very new to the market. Now, before we move on to another issue that I've been hearing a lot about, I want to ask you a little bit about the idea of landlords wanting the best candidates. Now, that makes sense, all things being equal, if it's just about the renter's outlook, their job, the likelihood they will stay in the area and keep paying rent. Now, what about discrimination? What about, just not liking the look of someone or thinking they're not as honest? What leeway isn't that something that's kind of hard to catch if you're saying it's about really the most reliable renter?
Yeah, 100%. It's very hard to catch. And I will say it is probably the one segment of the housing market where you definitely see discrimination. Like, you don't see it really in resale homes. I mean, people just make their offers, sell their home. Like, it's not
the 50s where they used to say
exactly
a clause like so and so can't own this, of different ethnic groups.
Exactly. Or like, I mean, again, I don't follow the US market, but you hear, I kind of follow what's going on just at a
steering. Steering where agents steer.
Agents steering people of certain ethnicities or background or race into one neighborhood or away from another one.
I actually personally, sorry to interject, John, that actually happened to my family when we were considering a move to, I believe it was Michigan, for a job that my mother is being offered. We were being steered by the real estate agent. I've never seen anything like that.
Or away from it, really?
Away from an area based on the ethnicity there, and told that, mainly families like yours and other families live here. Yeah.
Wow. That's unbelievable.
Yeah. But sorry, going back to the rental situation, it seems like there's a lot of leeway there. What makes someone more reliable or trustworthy or a better candidate than others can also hide a lot of discriminatory practice, no?
Yeah, it can, because the landlord doesn't have to say why they're rejecting a tenant, right? They don't have to give any reasons. I remember reading a story of like one agent who actually did tell the tenants that they got rejected because of their age. And it's like, like, obviously the real estate agent should not be doing that, but this is, landlords can reject tenants for any reason and don't have to give any justification for why. And yeah, you do see certainly more discrimination, I'd say, in the rental market than you see in the resale market, unfortunately.
And you've been highly critical, John, of the government policy of many decades, basically to allow mom and pop investors to build the rental market. In other words, the idea was, especially in the Toronto area, you'll have all these condos go up, let people buy them and rent them out, and that will provide enough rentals for everybody else. But it seems to me that if you have a market that's heavily construed that way, the risk of this, either discriminatory practice or other practices is high, as well as other things like renovictions. And you've touched upon that. And this idea of that you're saying you're asking the unit to be vacated for owner use. It's a little bit suspect, because it seems like that's a much easier way to raise your rents, right? Than trying to, if you're under rent control, obviously that would be very difficult to do. And I'm wondering if that situation where you have a lot of mom and pop investors making up the rental market in the Toronto area is made even worse in a condition in which we're seeing now, where mortgage rates are higher than we've seen in a very long time. So does the
Well,
temptation to rent-evict become higher? Because now some landlords are facing higher costs of being a
100%.
landlord, right?
Yeah. So just to unpack a few things
Mhm.
to start, most mom and pop landlords do not rent-evict, right?
Mm.
So to rent-evict, just to explain to the users, is basically the landlord has to put an application and say they are substantially renovating the property to the point where they need building permits and they need it vacated, right? Most small landlords do not do that because it's actually more complicated. You have to give the tenant the right to go back. Like there's all sorts of issues. So what they do, which is kind of easier for the landlord, to just say, I'm going to move into it. And that is a way easier way to evict the tenant. Now the tenant can dispute it and say, you're not negotiating good faith. I don't think you're moving. I don't think your family of 5 are going to move into this 1-bedroom condo. I think you're lying. And they can dispute it at the landlord tenant
Can I
board.
ask you a question, John?
Yeah.
Are they prevented from perhaps putting an older child in and saying,
No, they're
well,
not, 'cause
my son or daughter is moving in?
yeah,
then?
if their son's of age, yeah, but if their
Yes.
son's like 12 years old,
No,
no, yeah,
obviously not 12 years
yeah,
old.
if their
but
son's
yes.
of age, they could say
Mhm.
it's for my family, 100%.
Yes.
Yeah, so that is how most landlords are evicting tenants these days, and you're 100% right. Some of them are not doing it in good faith, which is why some tenants are not moving out, quite frankly. And they're doing it because their costs are going up and they need to increase their rent to cover their expenses. So certainly, I'd say that that's one. It's hard to get data on this, and
Mhm.
you know, we just hear about it. It's all very anecdotal. I think the landlord tenant board, I think I was reading some stats where like the number of those evictions was trending up. But you know, more broadly, kind of going back to kind of your earlier point about how we build rental housing in Canada. I mean, certainly for me, it's really it is quite backwards. I mean, it is not, you know, it is building condominiums as rentals is not a substitute for building permanent rental housing. You know what I mean? I mean, permanent rental housing is completely different because unlike condos owned by investors, a purpose-built rental is permanent. You know what I mean? That unit is not going to get sold to someone else tomorrow who's going to move in, which means the stock that's owned by mom and pop investors is not constant, right? And in this market right now, what you end up getting is potentially many of them selling because they can't handle the increased carrying costs, right? So tenants again are getting kicked out. So, you know, again, permanent purpose-built rentals provides far more security for tenants. It is permanent housing. You can't kick the tenant out for purchaser's own use because it's an apartment building that just doesn't exist. So it's a far better way to build rentals. And not to say that, you know, investors aren't good and you know, you need some small investors owning housing, but Toronto's market's backwards. It's like almost 100% of our rental stock is bought by mom and pop investors buying houses, and almost none of it is permanent rental housing.
And there has been a fear that with these really high interest rates, we would start to see a rise in listings of, let's say, primarily these condo units that have been rented out, being listed by landlords who can no longer afford to carry them, as you were mentioning. And that would presumably take out more rental supply at a time where competition's never been higher. Are you starting to see that? Are you starting to see a surge in that kind of listing in the data?
Well, I mean, we're not seeing a surge in it. I mean, we're kind of seeing it anecdotally. I can actually, I mean, now that you say it, I'll probably look at it because we can, I mean, look at the data and track the history of listings to see if we are actually seeing investors start exiting. I did that actually during COVID when listings surged at the start of COVID. It was, I basically found that it was just statistically, it was far more investors were exiting the market than owner occupiers. And I do wonder if that's what's going on. Now, some people might argue, well, it's not a bad thing because, you know, that allows someone to own or occupy the home now. What's the big deal, right? But again, I mean, I think part of this is, you know, you want to think about, you want to have kind of permanent rental housing solutions, not ones that sort of fluctuate depending on where interest rates are, you know, and tenants getting kicked out because the landlord can't, you know, can't carry their mortgage. You know, big corporations are not doing that. when they build purpose-built rental housing. So, I think it's unfortunate how we build housing today in Toronto.
Yeah, and presumably the risks are, as you said, like during the COVID period, we saw a lot of investors trying to exit the market quickly because there were no renters. Now, to put it in perspective, we haven't seen that surge in listings. There was a real pronounced surge in listings during the COVID time. We are not seeing that. In fact, we have been seeing a record low levels of listing for a while during this latest interest rate hike cycle. So we haven't really been seeing that tsunami of investors being pressured yet, I suspect, right? But I'm wondering if you're seeing a turning point or anything.
We are. New listings are picking up, but it's not a surge we saw, at the start of COVID. But inventory levels are gradually picking up. New listings are picking up. But again, I wouldn't say that it is like a flood of new listings yet. But I think it is still early. Like, I think it's been to the second half of this year, the beginning of next year, the more people need to renew at these much higher rates, you might start to see a little bit more pressure. But again, I don't know if it's going to be a tsunami. Like, you got to keep in mind that, many of the people these investors who own these condos, I mean, many of them have had them for 10 years or 8 years. Like, their mortgages are a fraction of the value of the condo in many cases, right?
And is that because those values obviously went to the top during this record price appreciation that we've seen? So they may be hitting this interest rate cycle that they haven't seen, this hike cycle that they haven't seen in a long time, but they've built a lot of equity. And in a lot of cases, they're not affected.
100%. And exactly. So not all of them are, not just they've built a ton of equity, the debt that they have is not significant, right? Because they bought it at much lower prices. So even if they have to renew at today's rates, their mortgage or their rent's going to cover their costs, right? So it's not like every investor is hanging on by a thread. I mean, I think that's a narrative that I see on Twitter. And certainly there are some who are over leveraged. My instinct is that's not necessarily the majority.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to look at, but it's definitely not a surge like we were seeing. And I think it would be really good to return to the story that you started with, because I do agree with you. I think one of the problems with housing policy in Canada, in Toronto as well, is it's so easy for politicians to talk about ideas and, oh, I've built a few homes here. And for all of us to say, oh, okay, well, that's great. It's a lot harder to understand the individual stories and how people can be facing these kind of challenges in an area like Toronto or Canada, which we generally pride on being a fairer place to live. So let's return back to that story. Now, on the surface, it seems like that renter has a few of the qualities that you were mentioning that even in an era of high competition would make this renter attractive. They have somebody co-signing with high assets and also giving 2 years of rent upfront. I mean, how much reassurance more could you give a landlord? Like, why isn't that enough, do you think, for this renter that you were speaking to personally?
So again, I don't know that their specific circumstances. It's tough to say. But I'll just say more broadly that, if an applicant's income isn't high enough to cover the rent, right? And most landlords are going to use a very simple sort of formula, which is kind of the formula that you use for, when you're buying a home. And that is that your before tax income should be roughly 3 times what your rent is, right? So if your rent is going to be $2,000 a month, well, you should be making $6,000 a month before you pay taxes, right? So $70,000 a year. And that is just a rough formula. So most landlords are going to look for that. So if you are a renter and your income is not high enough to cover the rent on its own, and or your credit isn't strong, like just say you've had poor credit and are not paying your bills, and either one of those is largely going to have a significant barrier for you to get an apartment or a house, even if you have an incredible cosigner, even if you have 2 years rent up front, because The landlord's concern is the landlord sometimes doesn't care so much about the cosigner, because at the end of the day, they're concerned about the rent each month, right? Is the cosigner cutting that household a check for $2,000 each month to cover the difference between, or $1,000 between what their income can support versus what the rent is? You know, maybe not. So if that household cannot pay the rent, it doesn't help to have a cosigner. At the end of the day, you're still going to the landlord tenant board, fighting someone who's not paying you rent for a year, right? So having the cosigner does not necessarily provide the security. And similarly, the 2 years rent up front is fine in theory. Like on the surface, it sounds, oh, it's amazing, you got the security. Yeah, maybe you have security, maybe, because maybe they fight to try to get some of that back. Maybe you have security for 2 years, but the question is, well, what happens after that? You know, if you have a household that you know can't pay their bills because their credit's poor and you can kind of see they're racking up debt or their income's not high enough, well, you're going to have that problem tomorrow. So yeah, maybe they have a wealthy family member who's cutting them a check up front, which is also a little suspicious. You got to think about that, right? How the heck are you, if your household is making X dollars a month, how are you getting all of this cash, right, to pay 2 years rent up front? You know, and when it sounds too good to be true, sometimes, like, some people get a little bit nervous as well, right? So, you know,
Yeah,
so there are a
but I
lot
can
of,
see,
yeah.
yes, but sorry, I can see a lot of groups that you mentioned, though, in this competitive market falling into that category. If you're new to Canada, you would not have built up much of a credit history. You could be a student or a professional being supported by somebody,
Okay.
and that's how you're trying to rent.
And
Or yeah,
yes,
so I mean, it seems
but
what we're seeing is I guess is tenuous, is actually maybe not tenuous, given what you're saying about the types of people coming in.
so I'll tell you where landlords make exceptions, for example. So I did say, okay, if your income's not strong enough, your credit isn't great, all of those things, a year's rent up front is not going to influence the landlord. But, you know, when we have clients sometimes who are relocating here who have good jobs back in their home country. They have a certain designation, they have a certain profession, and you know, the landlord looks at their profile, looks at their LinkedIn profile, looks at, you know, what their situation is, and is more confident that they're going to get a job here in a certain range, in a certain income range, if that makes sense. Do you know what I mean?
Mhm.
So and I'm just speaking speaking with our clients, right? So, and not all landlords would do this, but some landlords that they see, like a Ukrainian refugee family that had good jobs there, they're coming with income, they're trying to settle here, and they'll say, okay, great, you worked at Microsoft in Ukraine and you're leaving here. Okay, fine. You don't have a job here, you don't have credit here, but you have, 2 years rent up front. They'll say, okay, I'm confident you're going to get a job here. You know what I mean? So they'll take a little bit of a risk in that situation because the person had a good job. Well, if you've been living here for 10 years and you don't, your income is only X dollars and that's not enough to support your home, the landlord's not going to take a gamble because there's less likely that that person's going to make more income. Do you know what I mean? So there are situations where landlords, will say, okay, I'll take a little bit of risk. This, the tenants look good, their profile looks good, and I'm confident, that they'll settle in and they'll be fine. You know what I mean? But again, it's very personal to the landlord.
Yeah. And so while it's good to look at these personal stories, the problem here is the politicians are almost relying again on this personalization or mom and popification of the rental market. And on top of it, there may be some benevolent people, like you said, you had some clients that were actually more willing to help people coming from a war situation.
We had a client who was like coaching a Ukrainian refugee family on finances and effectively telling them why they shouldn't rent it because it's going to be too expensive for them. I'm like, that was one, like, and we've had some rent it to them, but some who are just kind of helping people even just settle and work through their numbers and stuff like that. So yeah, we have had clients who are very supportive. So it's not all bad, but again, it's still very hard. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, and it's heartwarming as it is to hear about these nice landlord stories. The problem is they're piecemeal. That just depends on the personality. So that, I think, leads us to a really interesting last question that was posed to you on Twitter by a viewer. If you could go back in history, what policies would you have implemented to prevent the housing crisis we have today? What could governments have done 10 to 15 years ago?
Interesting. Okay, there's two parts to that. I mean, number one, just more broadly, and it is not necessarily a housing idea, but I mean, fundamentally, the idea that a country's population should not be growing beyond its ability to support the people that it is bringing here. And to me, one of those is housing. Like at the end of the day, we're a country that believes housing is a human right, or we say that, but we are inviting people knowing full well that there's no homes for them. And they're being put in situations that are very difficult and putting a ton of stress on families. So on the new families and families that are already here. So I think fundamentally, to me, that's a very important idea. We kind of had that in the past, you know what I mean? And this is why we didn't have a crisis 10 years ago. This crisis is kind of new. So, you know, this is a starting point. But beyond that, of course, it is not just, you know, population growth. Part of it is how our housing market works. And you know, before talking about, I mean, when people talk about policies, I think what they're really asking for are, you know, what are the instruments? Like, what are the specific tweaks or taxes or whatever that you would put in place to fix the crisis? And to me, that's not the right question, because the right question is even thinking about what we want our housing markets to look like, you know what I mean, at a broader level. And to me, again, I think that's where I differ from a lot of the sort of the housing advocates. I mean, most housing advocates think, well, everything's great, we just need to build more homes. Like, let's just keep doing what we're doing. Let's keep investors buying the micro condos. Let's just build more of them, right? Let's build a little bit more densely in neighborhoods. And I tend to not agree with that. I mean, and this really has to do with how housing markets are kind of structured. So if we think about just and how housing, the role housing plays in a political economy just more broadly, right? And Canada's model, if we kind of think about kind of just two broad models in terms of sort of how housing structured, is, you know, very neoliberal in the sense that when we look at sort of literature, when they talk about neoliberal housing policies, it's really about housing economies that prioritize home ownership, that prioritize owning a home as a financial asset, and that prioritize even rentals as financial assets. Effectively, real estate, you know, it like housing, I don't want to say real estate because commercial is different. Housing is sort of viewed as a financial asset, and that's kind of the most important sort of thing. Whereas in other economies, the role of housing is very different. And when we think about rental housing, right, and sort of neoliberal regimes like North America, there's kind of two types of rental housing. There is deeply affordable, means-tested housing, and then there is market rate for-profit rental housing. That's it, just like the two extremes, right? And in many other countries that have far more integrated markets, they have way more rental housing, they prioritize rental housing, but they prioritize different types of rental housing. They prioritize nonprofit rental housing, they prioritize co-ops. So there are far more options. And, you know, I tend to think a healthy housing market is one that should have far more options for renters, because what ends up happening when you don't is you have what is happening today, which is like a massive shift in wealth inequality that is being fueled by housing. And to me, that is not the right way to structure an economy or a housing market. And I think this is, again, so just building more homes does not solve that. Like, and when we think about rental housing in Canada, you know, you need to sort of disincentivize the type of housing that we're building if we don't like it, which is only mom and pop, you know, investors buying condos, and incentivize the type of rentals that we want to build, you know, purpose-built rental, nonprofit rental. and deeply affordable rentals. I mean, Canada has abandoned building affordable housing. I mean, to me, that is it's just a disaster. And anyone who's like against government building housing, I mean, just doesn't know what they're talking about, because the only people who are going to build deeply affordable housing is the state. Like, it's not the job of the private sector to build rentals that are, below market rents. It is the job of the government to do that, to kind of support the people. And they've kind of just given up on that. So, I think just at a high level, how we look at housing and how we value housing needs to shift. And I think my view is a minority view, because I think Canadians are real estate obsessed. You know what I mean? Like, I think StatsCan published this report a little while ago that looked at investors in Canada. And I think like one of the lines that caught me and just stood out is like, Canada is a country of real estate investors, right? So, what I'm suggesting, it kind of goes against everything that kind of motivates most Canadians, that this is some financial asset we should speculate on. We should just buy as many properties as possible, get corporations to buy our homes in the suburbs. You know what I mean? And again, so my approach, I think, or the way I look at housing, I'd say probably is a minority view for Canadians, and certainly for people in my industry. And which is why I don't agree with most of the things most sort of housing advocates are promoting, because to me, it's just more of the same. Like, it's not much is going to change. Yeah, you just might have more homes, but it doesn't change the sort of the structure of the role that housing plays in the economy.
Right. And I think you've wrapped it up nicely. A theme that we're hearing throughout the discussion is we might try very hard to move from the personal to the bigger policy level. But the problem is housing is extremely personal in Canada. So many politicians themselves are involved in the market, whether as small landlords, owners, or even have investments in bigger companies that own real estate. It is so personal in Canada, whether it's from that renter struggling, landlord issues, or maybe the nice landlord versus the bad landlord. And now you're saying basically we all have a stake in it. And it would be, easy to agree in principle, but very hard in fact to wean ourselves off of seeing housing as our own individual investment. So I don't think this tension is something that's going to change for a long time. So maybe future discussions we should have are, what can governments do in the meantime where maybe the culture doesn't allow for it yet? And maybe that's food for thought for a future discussion.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, I really enjoyed our chat today. Hopefully, viewers, you enjoyed what you heard. We appreciate all your comments and feedback. You can reach out to John on Twitter at John Pisalis. You can reach out to Move Smartly on Twitter at Move Smartly. You can also send emails to John at askjohn@movesmartly.com and to me at editor@movesmartly.com. I thank you so much for watching and listening to us, and look forward to joining you or having you join us again for our next episode. Thanks. Till next time.